Austin was saying, yeah, from the previous point of view, it's like he wants us to see us equally like, all being like
Everyone communicate. Everyone can communicate.
he wants everyone to be
What does communicate?
Todos.
So we yeah, but the second part, what you actually plan and I'm the person.
Do you understand? You want right now?
They'll stand up.
I found it.
That's what it is something good.
Yeah.
It will make sense. But it will make
Very. Could you be able to say
Todos de acuerdo con todos.
todos con acuerdo con todos?
and then afterwards
You could say it's some what were we just talking about in school? No, it's important that we're united and
respetar los todos, comunicar.
Con que me da igual y no está mal.
Muy bien.
Okay? Listos? Still looking through the dictionary, desperate trying to find the last one. Okay, let's see then. Let's see what we've got. Let's say some arguments. Las chicas, por favor. What we're going to hear, sorry, by the way, we're going to hear some purple arguments, then we're going to hear some green ones. So hopefully we'll get two different opinions, okay? So let's start with the purple ones.
A mi modo de ver, estoy de acuerdo con la dictadura, con que me da igual y no está mal.
Muy bien. Okay, Arsen, por favor, ¿puedes traducir? Ambassadors, you should know. You should know if you're listening to one, you need to translate for the other one. Or ask her to repeat it if you're so... En español, Arsen, por favor. ¿Puedes repetir? Please.
Por favor.
A mi modo de ver, estoy de acuerdo con la dictadura, con que me da igual y no está mal.
Try the first bit. A mi modo de ver.
In my opinion, I think that I agree with the dictator's reason because
Me da igual
because everyone's equal and
no está mal.
nobody's
No está mal?
not bad.
It's not bad. Okay, let's just hear one more then. Girls, do you want to say your thing?
Miss, we didn't get to translate the sentence fully.
Okay, tell me what you've got then.
We've got
Tell me
some
how far you've got.
It would affect our home life because it'd take away our privado.
Our privado, privacy, is that what you're going to say? Muy bien. Okay, just to sum up then quickly, just tell me what the hardest part of that was, about having to do all that and think about that. Tell me what the obstacles were, something that we can work on for next time. I want to know the hardest part and the best part. Zarin, do you want to start? Zarin?
Finding best side of the argument.
Sorry?
Finding best side of the
Is
argument.
that the hardest or the easiest?
Hardest.
One of the hardest, seeing both sides of it. Agreeing with the dictator isn't always easy, is it? Very good. Okay, come on, some more then, some more feedback. Abu, what about you? Not being able to write it yet. It's the first thing. It's the comfort blanket, isn't it? Issa, what about you? Issa, what about the easiest or the hardest part of doing that? What was it? Yeah. Why is it hard to put a sentence together? What are the barriers?
Word order.
Word order, good. What else?
Actives.
Accent, yeah. Yes, a bit like what they're saying. Isn't it? Adjective comes after the noun. Excellent, very good. Yeah, so that's tricky. Also, it's verbs, isn't it? It's those kind of things you can't look up in dictionaries easily. They're the kind of things that, next time, that's clearly, isn't it, what we need to work on. And just as a very, very last thing quickly, what about language? Tell me why it's so important. Tell me in English just so we can get the full effect. Why is it so important? What does language do for us? I'm going to deliberately choose the quietest ones. So let's go with Sidney to start with that. Come on, in your head, come on, no, nobody else. Why is language important? I want you to think about it. Very good. So your ancestors use that language. Jakia, add to that, please.
Like your language is like part of you, so that's how you communicate with others, like how you get along with people.
Very good. It's part of you. It's how you communicate. Alia.
It's your identity. It's what makes you you.
Good. It's what makes you you. Why is it what makes you you? Come on, one last thing. Why is this what makes you you? Why does language make you you? Tell me. Explain it to me. I wasn't lucky enough to grow up bilingual. I wasn't in a fortunate position. I had to learn a language, okay? But tell me, come on, why is your language, the language that you'll go home and speak tonight, tell me, please, why is it so important to you? Try and get it across to me. Yeah, you can communicate with your family, which means that it's part of your national identity. If you can communicate with people at home, what does that mean? They will understand you. Yeah, very good. One last thing. And no difficulties. What does home mean to you? Place where you can stay, a place where your comfort zone. So language is all of these things, isn't it? Okay, guys, you've been amazing. Very good. Well done.
Like I said at the beginning, the focus of this session was going to be on, if I say SMSC, we talk about spirituality, moral, social, cultural. It was going to be an emphasis on spirituality, and that was part of some partnership class work. We started by asking Dr. Alan Flintman to do an audit of spirituality at the Westwood Academy. It is possible. Okay, and if you want a copy of that report that Alan completed, then if you just go to the Westwood Academy website, that's available to download. It's how to do an audit on spirituality in your school. Here we could have Alan here today for different reasons. We do have Nick from Lawrence Sheriff School. The spirituality focus of Westwood, which kicked this off, is very much down to Sasha Slavic, who's a teacher at my school, who's now the Reverend Sasha Slavic, who I just know that the audience, so I'm just acknowledging his initiative there. If we've got somebody who is knowledgeable about spirituality, I'd like more time on that aspect of SMSC and the social, moral, cultural, but we've got the time and the opportunity to look at this. And just debating with Wendy there about the approach of Sidney Stringer, I think it's pretty much the approach of Westwood, which these things are actually very difficult to plan for if you want to plan for it. Sometimes you can plan for it because that is a real focus. That's what that lesson is going to be about. It's about the cultural aspects of a This is a lesson about morality. It's possible to do that. Sometimes observing lessons, Andy, I think you used the word that it's incidentally arisen. Grab it, celebrate it, tease it out, make the most of it. Don't, because it's been a fantastic opportunity, said, That's not in my lesson plan, I'd better not touch that. Because that's what makes a good education. Deliver your subjects, but SMSC makes the difference. It's the cream on the top. And I think there have been lots of opportunities in this session, even if you don't speak Spanish, that's the interest, isn't it? To maybe pick up on some practice. I'm just going to give you the opportunity for a few minutes, just to turn around to whoever's sitting next to you, just to maybe share, using the prompt sheet if you wish, just to share some aspects of spirituality that could have come from that lesson, could have arisen from that lesson. And we'll just ask for a bit of feedback in a second. Just over a few minutes. Thank you. Then I'd like to start off about spirituality. What did we cover? Okay. I'm not sure about the acoustics, okay, but recognizing and accepting diversity, okay, there was that thing there about Catalonia, the importance of Catalonia, is that what made you say that?
And their ideas of their own national
So there's some drawing down about cultural experiences. Sense of belonging was...
They were connecting with home and applying maybe a different situation to the UK about the dictatorship and how they would feel in that situation.
Okay. If I repeat it, I'm sorry, but I just want to make sure, I think it's a really good point. It's a sense of belonging, it was looking at comparisons with the UK.
Which also gets the creativity, I think, as well, for spirituality.
About the creativity, so it touches on a creative approach to spirituality.
You can also say that with a sense of belonging, it's because they feel part of like their group today in terms of their belonging to that cohort.
Yep.
So it's not just at home or with their language, but what they were actually doing.
Yep, that's sure. I think, would you like to just come back? Can we apply spirituality to the students' experience? Yeah.
Ideally, yes. I mean, that's kind of what we're looking for as much as we're in the teaching. And the sense of belonging, obviously, they're going to have that emphasised by the fact that they've got all these people watching them. So that's not a natural situation, but it will enhance that. And I thought, I was fascinated by this use of ambassadors. And I've just been finding out about the ambassadors and their role. For a start, I had them big tick under developing a caring attitude towards others. But they sort of enhanced that concept of belonging because it gives them a special aspect within the groups and as a class.
Anything else? Please.
I thought it was interesting the task which some of them found it difficult was when they had to project themselves into the shoes of a dictator and not just say, look, you're doing this because I'm telling you to do it, but how could someone justify that was the right thing to do? And it helped them, I think, possibly explore a little bit of why that was important, why that was significant, why that might feel a bit alien thinking in that way.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I've got that into the recognising and accepting difference and diversity. We don't have to like it at all. Indeed, I'd kind of hope that they wouldn't be liking it. But there's that concept that, you shouldn't demonise. You should try and at least get a concept. And that was, another really good element of spirituality, just as a part of natural teaching. Not as some sort of weird enforced, get down on your knees and pray and I can tick that box, but just as part of what you teach. It's kind of why spirituality is a normal thing, as long as you're not scared.
I think the dictator bit as part of develop an understanding of others. That means if you're able to understand a dictator, then why would you do such and such thing? And that opens your mind up to understand different points of view of people. You can understand why the Catalan people don't speak their language. You can also understand why the dictator would say, oh, you just speak one language. And I think that's a big step towards understanding people's point of view, where they're coming from, the reason why they would do what they do, and accepting differences.
Yes, absolutely. You don't actually need to put some of these things just in one of the boxes. They would tick multiples. And I've got that, I've numbered them down the side, these 12 different criteria of spiritual things that you might be able to pick up on. And there is number 12, the recognising diversity, but there's also developing the understanding of others, and you could probably put them in other sections as well, which again helps. If you're thinking, how would I do that? It helps to realise that a lot of things you do could actually tick a lot of boxes, could cover a spread, and as I say, without you forcing it, which I think is probably very important when you're trying to plan a lesson. You couldn't plan a lesson for the crazy amount of criteria that's just on this, let alone what you might be judged on for your teaching and learning and everything else.
That's the message I want you to leave today with, okay, for goodness sake, don't start planning a lesson trying to tick all these boxes. I use it simply that when I'm looking at a lesson, it's a prompt sheet for me. I'm not ticking it off. I'm almost sort of using some words and the expression to think, okay, yeah, that's what I've just seen. I think that is actually a good aspect of that lesson when I have to comment about SMSC. Okay, don't have it as part of a planning sheet, because that could then develop into literacy, numeracy, communications, cross-curricular ICT. Do we still have economic awareness, cross-curricular? Okay, you can a long list of things to plan for. Okay? The job is about the curriculum and the delivery of the curriculum. SMSC, important, not a tick-list approach. Okay, thank you. Can we just then get back to whoever you're talking with? If you fed up with them, just turn around the other way around. And just talk about maybe the moral, the social, the cultural aspects as well. And we'll get Nick as well to comment about that.
Let's give full marks to children, you know, taking, almost teaching the lesson at that point. But we've just got to consider the linguistic development. And we're still into translating from Spanish into English. And actually, in terms of language acquisition, developing short phrases, new idiom, new vocabulary, and using them productively. We're not doing that at this stage, and it is taking, as I say, 6 minutes. So we're still at the point of setting the scene. We're still at the point of establishing a rationale for the language, Spanish, that we're going to learn and productively use and apply. And we're heading for 20 minutes. So we do need to get into the linguistic mode now as quickly as we can. If you recall at that point, that's when the SOCO came out. That's the vocabulary. So they've got to get vocabulary from somewhere. They've got to get idiom from somewhere. And this is really, apart from the dictionaries, which take time to use, takes a long time to look for the word, might look for the wrong word, might be able to use where you found it. So that's going to be the key source, is the vocabulary. There's a lot of vocab on there, there's a lot of phrases on here. Well, that's fine, because without this, we're going to really struggle. So that's where we get a first introduction. And largely, to begin to think about, I'm being invited to mix English with Spanish in order to try and get over just initial views in response to the context, the scenario that's being well and truly shared at this point. And about 3 or 4 minutes to do that. Children persevere well. Children, there's absolutely nobody that's not participating here. But the key thing is, to what extent are they able to navigate around the words and phrases. 3 or 4 minutes, it's not a long time. A language, then I thought that was a good idea. For discussion in English, we wouldn't have been able to have done that in Spanish. Fine. But just got 9 o'clock, and we are moving into sort of the first 10 minutes now, and we are talking about linguistic development, so we need to get into the foreign language sooner than later. We've got about 2 minutes follow-up as well, question and answer. Again, it's got to be in English, because the children have been talking quite clearly about this concept in English. Although I thought it was interesting the way the teacher tried to link the children's feedback in English with key vocabulary, key lexis, key idiom in Spanish. So we started to get things like, you know, so if you're frustrated, so if you're passionate, what's the Spanish passionate kind of thing. And we've got 19 children, so it was variable. But I would say probably a third made contributions, although by and large, simple vocabulary items, very, very short phrases, if that. And we need to build quite rapidly now, because we are moving into the first 15 minutes of the learning experience. So at this point, if you recall, and this takes about 6 minutes, This is quite a lengthy phase of learning where we got the ambassadors out of the front introducing this concept of speaking two languages. Remember, all the students in this group speak two languages. This notion of having a dictator in the UK, English only, bringing in Franco. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of things for children to take in. In terms of challenge, there's a lot of challenge here. Let's not forget it is a modern languages lesson, and they're going to have to make a big leap in a few moments to begin to think about not just how they would feel, the kind of things you were talking about in terms of SMSC, in terms of having one language imposed upon them, or their home languages, or their languages that they're passionate about being banned in Spanish. And I'm really wanting to see that developing. Otherwise, we could be in a philosophy lesson, an ethics lesson, an RE lesson, a history lesson, or whatever. So I want to see it developing. And of course, because we've got, if you recall, the context in Spanish, which is fine, absolutely fine, then it's taking time for children again to translate the scenario into English and obviously fully connect. Let's give full marks to children, taking, almost teaching the lesson at that point, but we've just got to consider the linguistic development, and we're still into translating from Spanish into English, and actually in terms of language acquisition, developing short phrases, new idiom, new vocabulary, and using them productively. We're not doing that at this stage, and it is taking, as I say, 6 minutes. So we're still at the point of setting the scene, begin to try and connect them together in order to initially, with probably some English prompts in between, it's not a bad strategy to give some initial views about the scenario. It's challenging. Although we're persevering around, I'm not hearing an awful lot of confident Spanish at this point. I perhaps don't expect to, because they've come into contact with this particular list. They may have seen the word list before, I have no idea. But they're certainly having to, as I say, navigate around a good 30, 40 times of expressions and items of vocabulary. And then, of course, in the actual sharing, because there wasn't an awful, very developmental in pairs and groups, in terms of the sharing, I think we had about 3 or 4 contributing out of the 18 students. So we're starting at this point, but we're well into the experience now to begin to acquire. We're at a very early stage of acquiring, being familiar with new structures, new idiom, new vocabulary, and it's how we move on from this point, because at this point, we're probably into around about 23, 24, 25 minutes. In a normal experience, I might be thinking about moving on within 5 minutes, but the whole experience lasts for around 40, so we've got another sort of 15 minutes to see, 16 minutes or so, how it moves on. This is the moment, if you recall, ladies and gentlemen, when we get largely the pièce de résistance here, forgive me, because it's Spanish, but largely the pièce de résistance because it's differentiated as well quite clearly in terms of a slightly different task for the higher attainers, the ambassadors, but this is where they're going to go back to the Socorro, and they're going to hopefully begin to connect relevant words, phrases, idiom, expression, think about things they've learnt in the past, join it together to begin to respond to some of the questions here. And we've got a good 5 minutes or so in their pairs to do that. We've got a lot of industry. We've got a huge amount of industry. There isn't anybody that's not really focusing, really trying to respond to questions. I'm not so sure that that's not a little bit too dense in terms of the demand placed on these young people, because they're coping with, instead of just looking at the odd one or two things, they come with quite a big agenda here, and they're coping with quite a big agenda down here in terms of a lot of quite testing structures and language. Some take longer than others. Some take longer than others to get it together. There's a lot of discussion in English. We certainly start, but it's variable. It is variable. We certainly start to get some pairs producing 2 or 3 sentences. They're very reliant on, quite clearly, Socorro. So without Socorro, they're going to be lost. So in terms of embedding, I think probably the agenda is a bit over-challenging, but nonetheless, the pronunciation, the intonation, and some of the fluency that I'm hearing around, although it is variable, as I say, in terms of how we're beginning to put these structures together, is impressive. And at the end, of course, we get a couple who feed back. And you know, those sentences make sense, and as I say, the pronunciation, the fluency, the intonation is impressive. But that's not representative of the whole of the group. The whole of the group, I think, have picked up an awful lot about, we were talking about earlier, Catalan, language, home language, passion, belonging, sense of, and all of that. But in terms of linguistic development, it's fragile. It's still very fragile, and it's still very reliant on props. And I just feel that that's because the actual context is very challenging indeed. And the language development, the linguistic aptitude, linguistic competency has to be, in a way, to respond to some of these elements. We could possibly have taken out one angle alone, dealt with less language and asked children to rehearse it perhaps with a bit more spontaneity. We're at a very early stage here in terms of the learning journey, you know, it being informed, acquiring, gathering information, assimilating it, absorbing it, repeating, regurgitating, imitating, feeling confident about, you know, making meaning for themselves because it's theirs now, and then beginning to apply and use it for the purposes of. We're at a very early stage of that journey, ladies and gentlemen, after 35 minutes. We're largely still acquiring, and we're largely still making sense and making meaning. And that's not to say that they've been dampened, the enthusiasm. Don't think they have for a moment. It's not to say they're going to come back next lesson and you know, take it from where we've left off. But there'll need to be some kind of simplification which enables them to move, the vast majority of them, increasingly away from the Socorro to be able to use perhaps, you know, only, well, I don't know, a quarter of the phrases in the intake, if that, confidently, fluently, for the purposes of practical communication. So there's some observations about some of the positives and some areas certainly here for further development. But this is what, you know, we're talking about in terms of learning and progression. The SMSC, very strong that it was and very important that it is a byproduct of that, and it's certainly a rationale for teaching. So I hope that's been helpful in sort of thinking about SMSC, thinking about learning and progression, fusing the two together whilst maintaining a very clear perspective about the quality of learning experiences and overall, critically, achievement. And remember, at the end of the day, 3 questions that we always ask, and I'm always banging on about these, I know. It's about change. It's about how much has changed, and I hope I've been able to try and take you through that just now. For how many, and most importantly, by how much. And that's the depth of it. That's the stick of it. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Andy, I wonder if we just had any time, if anybody had any questions. We've got time, just a few minutes. Please.
Yeah. I think in a way, I'm not going to pick a question. I'm not going to pick a question. But within schools, and I keep saying this, and we're not going to do it, he says, but we really must try and almost subvert ourselves, because within schools we're becoming older now, I think, preoccupied about numbers. And we're not actually going to improve teaching learning if we just get preoccupied with what's is it a 3, is it a 4, is it a 1 or a 2? The most important conversation is the conversation about the strengths and what we need to do to develop further, I think. And whilst we've got a national system that majors on grades, and we're going to have, by all accounts, as we announced the announcement this morning about all these troops walking into local authorities, then it's very, very difficult to get away from that. I think what I would say in this scenario would be that in terms of the children's ability to use the foreign language, albeit at an early stage of development, to talk about the scenario that we've seen today, I think it's fragile. I think there's a lot of development still required. Any other questions?
Would you have been, do you think, the lesson, is it okay, let's say, from because you kind of feel under a bit of pressure, or I feel under a bit of pressure to have at least 3 objectives. Would it have been, or success criteria,
fine.
Would it have been fine for her to pick one, and then make sure that I'm able to voice some strong opinions in Spanish, and really focus on that? So
Let me just repeat that for the people who might not have heard it. Colleague here feeling under pressure about having multiple objectives or multiple success criteria. Just suggestion, would it be okay, in a different scenario, or indeed in this one, if we'd have focused on one objective and had a limited amount of response of, in this case, vocabulary language. Personally and professionally, I think that's the only way forward. Certainly not looking for multiple objectives. I think I find myself saying more and more to teachers in schools, less is more. Less is more. Depth is the important thing, and very often scenarios that should be and could be and will be, I'm sure, in the longer term, highly effective, are not, simply because there's too much goes on, too busy. I'm not necessarily talking about the scenario we've seen today, but I'm talking in general. And we don't give children enough time to get to grips with less. There's almost a preoccupation that excellence means more, means lots, means very, very, well, Roger used the word earlier on, lots of pace, lots of rapidity, and that's not really the case. We don't want lessons that chug along and are at risk of stopping, and momentum and rhythm disappears for a good number of students. But we do want students, yes, being challenged, but also really getting to grips with whatever's on offer, and showing quite quickly, there's the rapidity, that they can absorb, they can internalise, and then they can begin to use. And very often the key to that is less. And in this instance here, I'll be frank, I think that is a very challenging board. And I think if we'd have asked one question and asked for 2 or 3 different angles, we might have got actually a lot more fluency, a lot more spontaneity quicker, and therefore greater progression. So I think that, but please don't be preoccupied as teachers with, or please don't think, because this is very old guard now, that there has to be at least 3, 4 objectives or success criteria in a lesson for a lesson to, be guaranteed of delivering progress.
Can we make this the last question? Yes, you wanted to go ahead. Just last question, then we need to...
From an observer's perspective and as a non-linguist, when I look back at the learning objectives, she would appear from a non-specialist perspective to have kind of hit some of those. So is the suggestion that, because I wouldn't have looked for necessarily the depth of language development that you've talked about, because you're coming from a linguist perspective. So
it's a Spanish lesson.
Sure. So what you're suggesting is that actually from the very start the objectives were less appropriate than they should have been.
I think there's not enough linguistic content necessarily or thought in those objectives. Yeah.
Colleagues, 130, 40 secondary school teachers here, 46 in the evening. I'm full of admiration for you, for the new people here. It's like a journey, isn't it? Every time I come along to one of these sessions, then I learn more and more and more. It's very much about the focus on the teaching and learning. Personally in school, I try not to mention the big old words now. I just talk about what's good practice, what's effective, what's the impact of that as well. And it's sort of weaning ourselves away from that final grade. Very important for individual teachers. This is how we get better through these sessions. Most effective CPD, I know. Andy has now promised, as a result of your steering group, and from my perspective, if my teachers are going in to observe lessons, I want them to be able to write good, evaluative judgments for their colleagues. Okay, so Andy has promised now to do something which an inspector might write down on a lesson observation format about the lesson. Okay, we might not put a grade there, but it would be about the lesson and clue you in as to what might be a good comment rather than just purely descriptive comments that you might have to write if you're observing the colleagues. It's about quality. You judging another professional has to be good. Okay, it has to be good. So we're just going to change direction slightly there as well. I'm going to say a huge thank you to Gemma. I'm going to say thank you to Nick, very different perspective. Thank you to Wendy and Nick Shelley, who I should have introduced over there, a member of the steering group partnership plus.
Absolutely, and just to say a big thank you to Gemma. I think perhaps she probably didn't quite hit the linguistic points there, but I think it certainly was a really positive learning experience for the students. And thank you to all of you as well for coming and making the effort.
Safe journey home, please. Thanks,
very interesting to see how the SMSC can be put into things, but then it's made me comforted in a way to know that we don't have to necessarily plan for it, and it's not going to be a massive impact in terms of workload as well, but the fact that it will crop up in lessons and it's fine for it to crop up, and we just have the flexibility to go with it. And if somebody asks us a question that has got some kind of SMSC content, then let's take that and let's fly with it, but let's not be really beating ourselves up about, I need to make sure that this is in the 10th minute of the lesson.
I found it reassuring because it's nice to know that if it naturally occurs, then it should be in there, but I think shoehorning it into every lesson would have been absolutely pointless. So it was really reassuring to hear Andy say that you shouldn't force it in, and I think this lesson is perhaps a really good example of trying to put SCMS into a lesson where actually it didn't really belong in the way it was done. So I thought that was really useful and reassuring, like you said, because it is a worry to try and fit it in.
And it's always good to hear, from an Ofsted perspective, that the lessons are going back to the simplicity, because you don't have to worry about ticking X, Y and Z box. It is about the students learning and about how much progress they're making, and I've written on my sheet of paper, keep it simple. Okay, don't overload the lessons, keep it simple and just make sure that the kids are learning.
Well, as a modern linguist, I actually think she did a brilliant job, because she had a remit to teach Spanish with an emphasis on SMSC, and I just felt that she'd incorporated both elements really well. And I was conscious myself that the Spanish wasn't as prevalent as it should have been, but then when I thought of her remit, I actually felt that she addressed it superbly in the ways that I'm sure Andy and the others have outlined. So all in all, I thought it was an excellent experience, and some of the colleagues who came with me today felt that as well.